walking in a country road, and I've been chasing after my shadow.
Welcome back to the Camino podcast, episode 115. I'm Dave Whitson.
Nobody asked me my name.
I met today's guest a couple years ago when I was inching closer to finishing up my walk across the USA. I was on the Oregon Trail at that point, and I'd had a lovely stage leading into and across Boise, Idaho. Just a beautiful downtown there with a riverside trail. The Boise chapter of American Pilgrims hosted me for a talk. The inimitable Steve Walter and his Spaniard hosted me at their home. And Chad Estes, my guest in this episode, was kind enough to attend and treat me to a dinner in Boise's Basque neighborhood afterward. I spent a lot of time alone when walking through the US, so a night of pilgrim company went a long way in rejuvenating me for the final approach. It was with great interest then that I started following along with Chad's most recent pilgrimage as he set out on the Via de la Plata. It's always fun to see photos, of course, but the real draw was his writing, as Chad alternated between candid stories from the trail and reflective essays on his father. In the conversation that follows, we explored a number of themes that emerged from those write-ups, including rebounding from disappointment, processing grief, walking with intention, and writing openly and bravely while on the road. As I mentioned last episode, it'll be a while until I'm back again, but I'm leaving you with a good one. Stay tuned. Chad Estes, Boise, Idaho. Chad Estes of Boise, Idaho. Thanks for talking with me. We've met a couple times over the years in Boise on your turf, and then also at an American Pilgrims gathering. So it's great to be able to talk with you on the podcast.
It's great to see you again, Dave, and thanks for including me in this.
It's been a lot of fun following you on your most recent Camino. I know you are one of us, one of the chronic offenders out there who comes back time and time again. Let's start here. What was your Camino this year supposed to be?
I had hoped to lead a group of breast cancer survivors on a 2-week trip, and we were going to do the Francés route from Leon to Santiago. And so last year, I scoped out that. I had walked it once before, but I did that as a solo trip and not really in thinking about taking anybody else with me. So I wanted to go back and scout out that journey and figure out where exactly I would take them and kind of map out what I had in my head and in my heart for kind of a healing journey along the way for them as well. So my daughter, Bonnie, was with me, and also another friend of mine who's a breast cancer survivor herself. And so we walked that last June and July, those last couple of weeks, to plan for that. But then shortly after I got home, I found out that the organization that I was partnering with to do that had some other priorities. And so they were not going to be able to do that. And they wanted to put it off for a year or more. I certainly understood, being a part of that organization, I understood why they needed to hit pause. But at the same time, I had in mind some of the people who had already expressed an interest to come and didn't feel like I could wait for a year or two. So I was looking at pushing ahead and doing it without their backing, which I wasn't sure how I was going to be able to do that financially, but we'd figure it out. And then one of those women got an infection and she passed. And it really threw me emotionally. And I thought maybe I'm trying to force something here that is supposed to pause right now. And another lady that wanted to go, she had a new type of cancer show up. And at that point I went, I really do need to just stop at this point. So that had been my original plan that I was going to do this year.
So I've led high schoolers. I know how to think about organizing a Camino from a curricular perspective for, history, culture, and so on. As you were trying to conceive of leading a group on a healing pilgrimage, from a curricular discussion, thematic perspective, what was the vision? How were you going to do that? How are you going to put your group in a position to heal on pilgrimage?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have been through some seminars myself that were experiential based, that instead of sitting and listening to someone talk at you, they put you in exercises and interactions with each other that are very helpful. And I know you're familiar with this because when we were in San Antonio and you had a teaching opportunity, that's what you did to all of us that showed up, is that you put us in groups and allowed us to process together. And that's really how I had planned this trip, but I was also trying to integrate the different locations that we were at and things that were happening. So even though my background is religious, I've been a pastor for years and now I'm a hospice chaplain. This wasn't necessarily going to be a religious type of experience at all. And yet there are those expressions on the Camino that I wanted to take advantage of. Certainly the Cruz de Ferro of laying your burdens down. And then at the bottom of the hill, which is the harder part, it's not climbing up to that cross, it's the coming down. We were going to stay in the town by the river and allow people to, for lack of another term, have a baptism in that river and allow the things that had been hanging on to them to be washed downstream. And so I wasn't necessarily going to use all of the Christian terminology that I was used to. And yet some of the lessons and the healing journey that can come from that, we wanted to experience.
In looking back on this lost possibility, you wrote, "Is there a heaven for dreams?"
Right.
Did you arrive at an answer to that question?
It was really good. So the other part of this, what I ended up doing, and I know you haven't asked this question yet, but I lost my dad last August. And my dad had started suffering from some dementia, but we really didn't think he was at end of life. And he always had a foot in heaven. He always had, but I think we rounded up like 12 to 14 books on heaven near either in his little library next to his fireplace or next to his bed. It was just something that he always treasured. And I think when he found out that he was on hospice, there was even some discussion, had his health really deteriorated to a place where he should be on hospice? And he was gone 5 days later.
Wow.
I mean, he found out he had permission to go, and he celebrated my mom's birthday with us, and then he never got out of bed, and he was gone a few days later. And it was the most peaceful passing that I've experienced in all of the years that I've been bedside when someone passed. So that part was not traumatic. It really was it was a blessing. And yet I needed to grieve my dad's passing. And he passed at 80, which was too young for me. And I would have appreciated him being around a lot more. So not having the other project to work on, more or less at the end of the year, I decided, you know what, I think I'm going to go walk another Camino, and I'm going to do it for me. And I want to process my dad's loss in his life. And so that's what I ended up doing. So I was kind of holding those two things, the reality of losing my dad and what that felt like, and the reality of losing this dream and what that felt like. And my faith and my dad's faith includes a hope of heaven, a hope of life beyond this veil of where we're living now. But that's what I was contrasting with, is what do I do with these dreams that have died? I think what I experienced along the way, I thought I would process more about it as I walked, but I don't think it was really till the end of it that I realized that this whole journey, in terms of what I wasn't able to do, it was about letting go. And I was able to do that. And I don't do that with regrets. I don't look back with frustration anymore that things didn't happen the way that I wanted them to. I realized it was a beautiful dream, and I would have loved it to have happened. And I would have loved it to have happened with those women that really wanted to go. And I was able to lean into the celebration of the creativity that helped dream that trip up. And even though we didn't get to experience it, and to celebrate that part of life.
One door closes and another opens.
Yeah. And who knows what will happen with that down the road? I really don't know. but I want whatever happens with it for it to be without striving and human manipulation. I don't want to force something through because I don't think we would have the same experience out there on the Camino if it was something that was forced.
Some people find the reasons they're on pilgrimage while they're walking, right? They
So
hear the
true.
they hear the call, and 3 weeks in, they figure out why they're actually there. Others are more deliberate about establishing intentions. And having met you and read your writings, you strike me as clearly much more of the latter. Is that fair? And
Yeah.
what was your vision behind this walk? You've mentioned your dad, of course, but
Yeah.
what other targets or what other ideas did you have for what you were trying to accomplish on pilgrimage?
I have not always been this intentional. I would say my very first Camino was back in 2022, and I did it with my wife and two daughters. And my intention on that trip was to go and be the dad and the husband and to take care of them. And then we started walking from Lisbon, and it became quite apparent that they didn't need me on the Camino. They were just fine. So then all of a sudden I was walking without a purpose. And that is one of the things that led me to, oh, I think it would benefit me to go back and do one of these for me. What would that look like? So I think being intentional has continued to grow each of the last 5 years that I've done this. And this by far was my most intentional walk. I wish it hadn't taken me 5 years to get there, but that's growth, right?
Yeah.
And each of them have been different. But yeah, this one was very intentional in terms of the path that I chose. The Via de Plata is a beautiful path, and I looked forward in my research to walking that journey through those regions. But I knew that it was going to be more solitary, and it would give me time to process and give me time to write. And I wanted to do both of those, as well as take some photos. And because that was part of my relationship with my dad, that he got me into photography. And I thought that this would be a good path to do it on.
It's a question I wanted to ask you later when we talk more about the Via de la Plata, but it did occur to me that obviously you can have a powerful transformative experience on any Camino, right? But it did seem like for what you were trying to accomplish, the Via de la Plata is particularly well suited, given that it is longer stretches without towns, not as many pilgrims. The conditions are just kind of more austere, which I think can align well with that kind of reflective process.
I so agree. I would try not to share my journeys as this is the way to do it, right? Because all of these Caminos are different. And yet for me, this was definitely very conducive towards what I wanted to get out of it, both the time and the distance and the hardships along the way. It allowed me to gain that experience that I was hoping for. Yes.
You mentioned you're a hospice chaplain.
Yeah.
And so I was curious. I remember when I spoke with Alexander John Shaya, who wrote the book Returning from Camino. I asked him kind of his context, his background, because I figured, you're writing the book, you have expertise. And his answer was, no. I wrote the book because I had no idea how to return from Camino, right? Like I had these questions that I needed to answer. And that then the process allowed him to write the book. Your professional expertise, in part, I would imagine, is on grief, on leave taking. Did that set you up to be able to then bring all of that professional learning to your personal life as you were on Camino? Or was it just a completely different experience when it's your father, your life, as opposed to all of the people you're working with in hospice?
I have had the advantage of going on these trips the last 5 years. And each time I feel like I'm bringing more things home that I've learned and experienced that help me in that role as a chaplain. But certainly this year, having gone through more personal loss myself and being able to be present with myself for that and let those feelings flow through me, it was very impacting and towards thinking of coming back to my job what I wanted to invest in the lives of both my patients and their families. And to do that, I needed to let that go. It was interesting. The other Caminos I've done have all been around 4 to 6 weeks, so they've been longer Caminos. I sort of feel like us Americans, when we fly over there, it costs so much that it's worth the investment of doing these longer Caminos. But I've always had more time off or taken time off without pay to make that happen. This one actually felt like a sabbatical, where I have been working in this role for 7 years, and it was a time to take a break and shut all of that off and kind of reevaluate life and where I was at. And I was very appreciative to realize I really love my job. I really like what I get to do. I like to show up and be present for that. And this Camino experience and walking through grief myself the way that I did is going to help me be more present for the role that I have.
What are the insights that you brought from that work in hospice to processing your own grief? What are the techniques or the strategies that you wove into this process on the Camino?
When we talk about grief, a lot of times people want it to be over with. It's so intense, right? And they're like, how do I stop feeling the way that I do? The reality is the reason that we feel grief is because we've experienced a loss. We've experienced a change we didn't want in our lives and in our relationships. And we really don't want those feelings of loss to go away, because grief is love that has no place to go anymore, right? So those feelings of expressions of love that we would give somebody when they're not there to receive them, that's what it is that we're grieving. So I don't want that feeling in me about my dad to go away. So I don't want to forget that. I don't need it to feel as painful as it does. But I think when we allow grief to do its work in us, we can morph that pain into, at least in my situation, I really got to focus on gratitude of the time that I did have with my dad and the investments that he had made into me and my life and how I could carry that forward. And so instead of just mourning, it really morphed into this time of gratitude and joy for the time that I did get to have with him. So I don't like the term grief recovery, because I don't think we want it to go away. I think we want to move through it. It's more grief support. And so realizing that from my own journey is the way I want to support people in their bereavement back home.
You wrote that grief is not something to get over. Grief is something we go through. Yeah. And it left me wondering, if Santiago's the destination we're oriented towards on the Camino, what's the destination we're moving towards on the grieving process? And it sounds like gratitude is one answer to that question.
It is. And I think this, like you said, the Via de Plata is kind of a different animal out there than some of the other routes. I definitely experienced different emotions, not just the grief. And I think this was the first time, and even though I've talked about this with words, this is the first time that I have allowed the emotions that I was feeling to be present with them, and then to allow them to pass through me and not to hold on to them. When I did the Francés 3 years ago, one of my big revelations is that I'm not very kind to myself. I provide a lot of care to other people, but I don't have a lot of self-care when it comes to me. I have a lot of judgments towards myself. And coming home, that's what I really had to wrestle with, is what do I do with this knowledge? And so one of the ways I would express that is, like, if I got angry, then I would get upset at myself for getting angry, because you should be above that. You should be beyond that. And I allowed myself on these 6 weeks, on these 1,000 kilometers, to whatever emotion was coming up, I just let it be. And the good thing is that I realized it was there for a reason. but that I didn't have to hold on to it. And it was a great experiment of embracing those emotions and not holding them. And there was beauty in that. And that's the first time I've given myself the grace to really do that.
Mm. It seems like that's part of the power of the Camino in terms of the grief process. Is it's just as simple as time and space and being in your head for hours a day, no other distractions, and just sort of allowing yourself to circle around those memories. It seems like the challenge sometimes is, how do we avoid perseverating? How do we actually allow ourselves to move forward instead of just getting stuck? What have you found helpful for that, in terms of like, how do you get out maybe of a troublesome loop and can move towards more positive outcomes?
That's a great question. You know, a discipline for me that works is writing.
Mm.
When I start taking the things that are in my head and I start processing them in writing, even some of the editing process of where I'm starting with that article or thought or journal entry or whatever, and as I write it out, it's like a journey itself. And I get to the end, and it's different. There's movement.
I'm not going to turn this into an AI conversation, but for me, that's exactly why I recoil when I hear people say that like they like using AI as an organizational and processing tool, because a writer knows that is the intellectual work, is taking that mess, that circular, that spiral of thoughts out of our head and finding a way to impose structure, make it move in some sort of a linear fashion. That's critical work. And it's not only work that results in something in words on paper, but it also provides clarity within our own mind.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Some of the most traumatic experiences that I have had is when I was a volunteer for Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep. And that's an organization that sends professional photographers into hospitals to take legacy portraits when there's been a demise at birth. Wow. And some of those situations are just very, very, very difficult. I mean, all of them are hard. But my background, my training as a pastor, you know, when I would go into those rooms as a pastor, I always felt like I had to give some words of comfort. Well, there are no words of comfort when you've lost a child at birth. When I showed up as a photographer with a camera, and I didn't have to have words, and all I was there to do was to create these legacy portraits that could help the families enter into that grieving time and have tools for it down the road. I found that I was a better minister with my camera than I ever was with my words. But it impacted me in such a way that when I left the hospital, I needed to process it. And the best way for me to do it was to write. And some of those I got to share online, as long as I took out the identifying experiences that would, you know, say it was this family or this hospital or whatever. But that was when I really learned that I can process trauma through writing. And it also helped me see that other people in reading those experiences can identify with it, and it can benefit them as well. Which is why I think I chose not to just write what I did on this Camino in my own personal journal and keep it to myself, because I have found there's a benefit to others being able to process it as well. Even some people who don't get to go out and walk on their own, who said, you've taken me along on this journey. And so, yeah, writing for me is key in getting it out of my head and down into my heart.
I wanted to ask you about both of those topics, the process of writing on Camino, and then also the decision to post personal reflections publicly. I think a lot of people set forth on the Camino with the intention. They're carrying a journal. They're adding that weight to their pack. Right. That's a statement. But then you get there and you're tired and you're socializing, and you know, then maybe you look at your phone and that 1 hour you had in the evening slips away and nothing happens, right? There's one post at the beginning, half of a post on the second day, and then if you're lucky, a few bullet points. How do you make it happen? Because you were writing lengthy posts every day. What is your process?
Yeah, it's a good question, and that's kind of grown as I've walked through the Caminos. I think the first ones, I take a lot of photos as I walk, and I think I would look through those photos and it would bring me back through the day, and I would basically write my journal based on what I experienced in the day, and those photographs help me. But now I am actually using my headphones as a microphone. I've got those ear shocks, the
Yep.
ones that don't go in your ear, because I don't want to miss the sounds of the Camino. I love, everywhere from the clicking of my poles to the bells on the cows and the birds in the early morning and the church bells. I mean, all of that is really precious. So these earshock headphones, it's bone conduction and they're on the outside. And you can listen to music or a podcast or whatever if you need to. There were definitely a couple of hills or long days where it's like, okay, I got to put some tunes on to keep my feet moving forward. But really, what I was using it for is the microphone that is in those earphones. And I would hit record on my phone, and it's attached via Bluetooth, and put it back in my pocket. I couldn't hold my phone because I'm walking with poles. And basically, I would make a recording of everything that I wanted to say. So I'd have things in my head and I would just start talking. I would start telling stories and I would talk for about 45 minutes to an hour sometimes. And I don't know how this works on an iPhone, but on an Android, you can take the recorder and you can say, I want to share this to Google Docs,
Mm.
and it will transcribe everything that you said in this recording. I've used that when I recorded people before for articles that I was going to write. So I knew that I had this function. But of course, at the end of the day, then I've got this transcription of me speaking, which is so different from writing. Anne Lamott is a writer that I really enjoy, and she wrote a book called Bird by Bird, and it's on writing. And a quote that she has in there is, "You've got to write your shitty first draft."
Yep.
And that, at the end of the day, I'd open up Google Docs and there was my draft. And I basically was able to take that and edit it down into my written article.
Mm-hmm.
And it was probably, 2 to 3 times as long as what any of the articles were. I had to be a ruthless editor. I became a better writer on this trip because I was so ruthless with my stories. But there were longer stories about my dad. There were longer stories maybe about what I was feeling or going through that I realized if I was going to share this online, I didn't have the context for all of those things. So I needed to edit it down. But it would still take me, a couple of hours at the end of the day to do that. But that was why I was there. If I was doing a more social Camino, maybe I wouldn't have had that same experience of writing as much as I did, but that was why I came and I needed that processing time. And so I invested in it.
There are a few things more paralyzing than staring at a blank page or a
Oh my
blank
gosh.
document. And so
Right.
that always then gave you a starting point.
I had a starting point.
Yeah.
And there were some times that I recorded more than one a day. If something was really on my heart and on my mind, I wrote some letters to people that I thought, I will need to edit this, later when I get back. But this allowed me to, as I was processing and walking, because that's one of the beautiful things about the Camino, that forward movement, especially after that first week where your body is adjusting to everything. Once your body goes, oh, I guess we're doing this, that really frees up the mind to dive into these things. And so I wrote letters to people that I had things on my heart to say. And now I've got those recordings if I want to go back and edit those and actually send them. Or maybe it was just for me to process at the time. So I had a lot of different recordings. They didn't all turn into articles, but that helped me get it out and get it down. And of course, as I'm recording it, there's also the hello cow and buen camino to this, so there's other voices going on. I'm not shutting my recorder on and off. I've got to edit all of the other conversations that happen out at the end of the day as well.
Yeah. There's ample criticism of social media use and lots of people who are using social media for questionable reasons, for self-harming reasons. But I have found it interesting and in some ways like useful for me, like getting into the discipline of posting write-ups each day as an accountability mechanism. Like it forces me to follow through. There are days when I sit down to write and I realize like, crap, I don't have anything. I don't have anything to write about. And that actually sends me back out the door sometimes. It tells me that like I have missed out on something in town and I need to go find it. And so in that way, it adds to the walk. In what other ways did you find it helpful, productive to be putting these stories out in the world?
Yeah, certainly the feedback that I got, I didn't write it for that reason, but the connections that it gave me, to other people was definitely beneficial. Like I said, I've got some friends who said I never could get out there and go on a Camino, but I feel like you took me along. I feel like I'm there. And some people, they're grieving with a loss of their own. Some people it was they knew my dad and they appreciated hearing what was going on with my dad. I had my kids say, Dad, I didn't know that story. You'd never shared that part of your life with us, which there's some things that you don't share when they're kids that now that they're adults, maybe the opportunity just didn't come up, but they got to hear some of those stories and we got to talk about them later. Yeah. So for me, there was a real benefit of that. There's a vulnerability in posting the kind of writing that I do, but that's really the kind of work that I'm involved with, of people being vulnerable with me and letting me walk into such a sacred place in their life, especially towards the end of life and after they've lost someone. And so I need to be able to model that myself.
What is a story that you wrote about your dad that was important for you as you move through this process that also then seemed to be important for other people as they read it?
Well, probably the most important one for me, my dad was an artist. And when he retired from his, regular work, he could have been a full-time artist, and he made some decisions in life along the way to support his family and have a more normal job at Hewlett Packard, where he was doing packaging and design, where I wish he could have spent his whole life doing art because he really was a magnificent artist. But when he retired, he started doing some sculpture work. And he did a series called Dancers That Dance Upon Injustice. And the 4 bronzes that he made were of Abraham Lincoln, Mother Teresa, Anne Frank, and Martin Luther King Jr. And it was based on a line out of a song from his church that he loved. And he wanted to do this series of 24 people whose lives impacted injustice. And he told us that he wanted to do both famous people like these 4 people that he had done, as well as other more unknown people, and helped elevate their stories. And I mean, these sculptures, I'm not blowing smoke when I said my dad is talented. One of the Idaho governors bought one of his Lincoln statues and took it to DC with him. There's also another copy of it now in the Idaho Capitol building. The Martin Luther King Jr. bust, Martin Luther King Jr.'s son came and unveiled, and it's now in the Black History Museum here in Boise. So my dad's talented. And what I didn't share when Dad shared about what he wanted to do with this whole series, immediately I thought, oh, I want to be one of his sculptures. And that sounds pretty haughty, but what I really wanted was for my dad to see my life as having counted towards impacting this world in areas where justice isn't being felt or experienced. And so I never verbalized that, but that was part of my loss too, when he was gone, that we never had this chance to go down that path, and he didn't get the chance to finish this series, which that was in the back of my mind too. There were a lot of projects that my dad left on the table that he didn't get to finish, just like the journey with the breast cancer survivors that I wanted to take, that I didn't get to do this year. And yet my dad died without regrets. And, I don't think he felt like he hadn't fulfilled something just because he hadn't finished one of these projects. So I am walking one morning, and it's a beautiful morning, and there's fog, and there's pasture lands, and this mist, and there's these horses, and I feel like I feel like I'm in Narnia, and I'm surprised the horses aren't talking to me, right? And I'm processing about my dad and our interactions together and our discussions about injustice. And I thought about a picture that I had taken when I was 18 years old in the Philippines on a missions trip that he blew into a big poster and put a verse about what true fasting was, and how true fasting is not about some self-flagellation of to make God impressed with us of what we can give up, but true fasting is taking care of others that are in need. It is breaking the chains of injustice. And that's the phrase that he blew up this picture that I took of this little girl in this dump in Manila, and he blew it up into this poster and had it framed, and he put those words on the bottom of it to break the chains of injustice. And as I was processing that, I ended the article that way that day. I realized I was in such a privileged position, because though I did not get to be one of my dad's sculptures, I lived my whole life as his clay. He has pressed his care and compassion for people in this world into my life, and I'm living that out. I cried when my dad died, but I didn't have that big cleansing cry, and I wasn't sure why. And I got to on the Camino that morning, and I was so glad that there was no one around but the horses, and that just allowed me just to sob and just to wail. And at the same time, that's probably what really drove home the point that though I miss him, I'm carrying him with me, and he gave me his best parts, and it made me just so, so grateful. So that's what I felt like. I wanted to write that, and I wanted to share that. And so you say, well, how did that impact other people? I'm not really sure, because even though other people responded to it and I read them at the time, that's not what sticks in my mind. I really wrote those things for me. If it can bless somebody else, that's great. But I wrote that for me.
That rings true to me. Yeah. 95% of being a writer is writing for yourself. You hope that it's of service to others, but
Yes.
First and foremost, it has to be for you.
Yes. I've had a project where I've worked with breast cancer survivors for a long time now. And when I started doing it, we're sharing their stories. I'm interviewing them and writing their stories up and taking portraits, and we're sharing them in art shows. And I thought, oh, this will turn into a book someday where we'll have, a series of these. And it dawned on me a few years ago, I think actually when I was walking one of the Caminos, that the book that I'll write about that experience is not what our project did for those women. It's how those women have changed my life, because they have totally impacted me. And that's the story that I have to share. So, this was that opportunity to share my own journey, my own growth, which is different. I do see people write about the Camino in terms of what it can be or what it is for pilgrimage and all of these things out there. But the most impacting things that I read are when people are vulnerable and say, this is what it's doing to me. Those are the stories that I really appreciate.
And certainly the Via de la Plata puts you in a position of vulnerability
Gosh,
at different points.
Does.
So let's not just talk about it in a way where there's like an implicit intimidation factor with the Via de la
Yeah,
Plata. What are some other reasons that people might want to look at this route? Because it's there, it's been there for a long time. Like after the
yeah,
Francés, it was really one of the first to develop an infrastructure, and yet it's never really grown to any significant degree in terms of the amount of pilgrims walking every year.
right. For somebody who wants to have it's hard for me. Like you said, I don't want to talk anybody out of it at all, but this was harder. And I've done ones that were more physically harder. The first 2 weeks on the Norte with all of the mountains, right?
Yep.
And then my daughter and I took a left and we crossed over the Picos de Europas. And so physically, that route yet last year was physically harder. And yet this one had longer distances between services. And I think this happens on throughout Spain. You can't look up on Google Maps somebody's opening hours and expect it to be accurate, because what little bar is updating Google Maps on what days they're going to be open and closed and their opening hours? So if I put my expectations out there of what's going to be available to me based on Google's maps on this route, I would have been very disappointed. And sometimes, you walk into a town and they've got one restaurant and you're expecting, okay, that's where I'm going to get a meal. And it's a Sunday. And so they're only going to serve lunch. They're not going to serve dinner. And maybe that wasn't down there. But then you get there and they're like, yeah, something happened and they lost electricity. So the restaurant's closed too. And then the town that you walk to the next day, they were open on Sunday, but now they've taken Monday off. So now you've hit two towns in a row where you don't have the normal pilgrim experience, and so you've got to be prepared for that. And knowing that this could happen, I had things in my backpack that I could make a meal. I had a day's worth of food or a day and a half's worth of food that I know I wasn't going to starve. But there definitely is that food scarcity reality. And you also, when you pass by some place that's open, you go, oh, I should get some bananas. I should buy some more trail mix in the morning because it's hotter. This is the first time I've done this. I was pre-hydrating. I would drink half a liter to a liter before I started walking in the morning, knowing that the only water I was going to have in my hydration bag was what I started out with, because there was nowhere along the way to fill it up. So there were more hardships like that. But again, that just puts you in a place to receive from other things. So no, there's not a bar like there is every 5 to 10 kilometers on the Francés, but I've walked the Francés and I didn't need that experience. No, there's no agency to cart your backpack from one place you're staying to the next. But you know what? I needed to carry everything with me this year. It just gave me what I needed. There were enough pilgrims there that if I wanted community, I certainly had it in the evenings, but it also gave me the space if I wanted to leave early and walk without seeing anybody that day, I could do that as well.
That's one of the things that was striking to me in your post, that there was always a cluster of pilgrims around, 5, 10, 15. And it seemed like because of the circumstances on the route, there was a lot of connection among those pilgrims, or just a willingness to come together for a dinner or for a couple of days. One of the things I noticed being back on the Norte this year was just that people tended to be a little bit more fragmented. People were walking alone, or they had one or two people they were walking with, and they were pretty consistently going off on their own. Not as many, big pilgrim dinners coming together, but the reality of life on the Via de la Plata meant that you grabbed onto other people like a lifeline sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you need that balance. You need that time alone to process, but you also need some of the processing, even with grief, you don't get unless you're sharing it. And I did write about that. One of the powerful things that I found was this happened a couple years ago when my daughter and I were doing the Primitivo, that we met a pilgrim that was walking because he lost his son to cancer at 18. And he said it had been 2 years and everybody at home expected him to be over it. And he said, I'm not. And so I came to walk. And my daughter asked him one night over dinner, will you tell us about your son? And the stories just poured out. And we saw what a powerful thing that was, giving somebody the opportunity to share. And so in the same way that writing gives me an opportunity to process and share, getting to tell someone else your stories is so powerful. And that's one of the things that happened to me one of these nights here that I'd been processing about my dad. One of the pilgrims leaned across the table and said, tell me about your dad. I needed that so much, to be able to tell another person what I was experiencing and have them hold that with me. And that's a powerful thing.
There's a line that appears in one of your pieces of writing and it reappears later on. You observe that there's more color at the edges.
Yeah.
Talk about that line.
Well, I really loved getting up early in the morning and starting out in the dark. Part of it is I like to get outside of a town or a city or whatever and the lights that are there so that I can watch the sunrise come up. And those colors as the sun is coming in those early morning light are different than what the sun gives you when it's right on top of you. So I was noticing all of that color on the edges, and it was present in those photos that I was taking. And that was one of the things that I wondered out loud on the paper, is I wonder if life is this way too, if there's more color on the edges. That all happened. I think I wrote that down the first time at the beginning of what ended up being my longest day on the Via de Plata, and my experience at the end. And there was some trauma in the middle of it, in that the place that I thought I was going to stay after 36 kilometers, the gentleman had given my bed away. And I ended up having to keep walking. And it was like one of those days that you walked, Dave. It was 55 kilometers. And that might be normal for you, but it wasn't for this pilgrim.
It's a rough day.
I walked from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. But that trauma and even the anger that I experienced in the middle of the day towards him, I was able to process that and let it go. One of the benefits I found was that I got to experience in the daylight what I would have walked through in the dark the next morning. But then the grace and the hospitality that I was received with at the end of the day from the woman where I ended up staying, there was so much color and love in that. And that was happening as the sun was setting. And again, I was seeing this beautiful color. So I didn't have the energy to write it all that day because I was so exhausted, but I did some the next morning. And that was my experience, is that I got to live and experience those colors at the edges, both in the early morning and later in the evening. The sun having gone from one side to the other, east to west, as I was going south to north, and created this beautiful cross. But the grace that I really experienced was at those extremes.
Miserable as the feet are under those conditions, there is something remarkable about starting in the dark, ending in the dark, the visual journey you make, also the mental journey. Like, you have more than enough hours to walk yourself into anger, back out of anger, into a third entirely different mental state. I mean, there's just so many hours for you to process all manner of different emotions. It's a remarkable experience. Not that you wanted to have it.
No, not that I would plan for it. But you're right. At the end of it, there was this. I was so grateful that my body did it.
Yeah,
and that I could. It's not that I would want to plan it for the next day, but it was a good experience and one that I've carried with me. We can do hard things, and I will say, even giving my body the grace, when I can walk close to 5 kilometers an hour, if I'm not stopping to take pictures, I average about 4 because I stopped to take pictures. At the end of that day, I was walking 3 kilometers an hour. And that's as much as I could do. And just giving myself the grace for that, of going, of course it's going to be slower, of course you don't have any energy left. And allowing myself just to collapse at the end and celebrate.
It's an amazing accomplishment, as is the walk as a whole, as is all of the writing that you produce daily. So, Chad, thanks for putting all of that out in the world and then talking with me again about it now.
Thank you so much, Dave. I really appreciate it. Thanks for this opportunity.
I've been thinking a lot lately about how our relationship with the Camino, as is true with other relationships, can evolve over time. And also how there's an interesting dynamic that exists between the chronic offenders, people like me who have been walking pilgrimages now for decades, and people who are still discovering the Camino anew in 2026. I did a pilgrim Zoom conversation lately where I was invited to do something different, to explore an angle on pilgrimage that I hadn't elsewhere. My students used to joke about ideas that can get you canceled, beliefs they might have that they wouldn't share because they would be so unpopular. And I didn't think that this would get me totally canceled, but I did use that session to argue in favor of pilgrims talking more about politics. One important or essential distinction I tried to emphasize is between politics and politicians. There's maybe not as much room for productive discourse about specific political figures. There might not be that much more to be said. But I think the Camino is an incredible context in which to explore different ways we can come together, solve problems, and build a better world. If you can really talk with other pilgrims about anything, why not that? So that viewpoint stems out of having been thinking about, talking about, and writing about pilgrimage for a really long time. And to be clear, that doesn't make my perspective better or more valuable. One thing it does reflect, though, is how one's mind goes to different places as the years pass. Topics that might have been popular for me in my first or second year thinking about pilgrimage might have started to feel old or stale 5, 10 years in. And then along with that, I don't want to repeat myself. I'm sure I do repeat myself, but I always want to find new angles. I also, though, as I've talked about before, am all so here I am repeating myself, always leery of pilgrimage being framed as an individualistic, egocentric experience. So many forces in the world are steering us towards atomization, towards me first thinking, and I would love for pilgrimage to become something that has broader transformative power. And maybe that sounds a little pie in the sky, but I do see potential here, possibility. In that conversation, one of the hosts, Colleen, very helpfully observed that people making their first pilgrimage often have so much internal processing to do, a whole life's worth, that this matter of thinking bigger, thinking politically on pilgrimage, it might be more of a matter for those who are returning on their second, third, fourth, fifth. And the truth of that statement is undeniable. But then I was also thinking about this conversation with Chad. This certainly wasn't his first Camino, or his second, or his third. And it clearly was an important personal reflective experience. It'd be terrible if there was some weird restriction that said you only get to do that on your first or second, right? And there's always more to be done in our minds, in our lives. And it might take any number of Caminos to build the muscle to be able to do it well in a lasting, sustainable fashion. And of course, our life experience can shift in any number of unpredictable ways at any moment. You might think that you've processed everything there is to process, and then life happens. Here's an example of that. In the wake of speaking with Chad about the loss of his dad, mine ended up in the emergency room following a particularly alarming situation. It was a close one. Things have stabilized, but if I wanted to go for a walk in the aftermath of that It certainly wasn't to reflect on socialized healthcare or economic policies. The point I'm trying to make in a particularly long-winded and maybe indirect fashion is that all of this has me thinking about how to continue to push my own thinking about pilgrimage while also remaining grounded in some of the fundamental realities and core functions of it, the very same things that first drew me in all those years ago, and in so many ways keep me coming back. Pilgrimage can transform our lives, can elevate the quality of our lives. It's done it, I think, for many of us. And that's always going to be the hook, the thing that keeps us coming back. That's really important. Even as I hopefully understandably keep trying to find new ways to explore pilgrimage, new topics, new takes, even if I think there are some subtle traps bound up within that individual focus, it's important for me, and it's important to me, to not lose sight of those foundational purposes of pilgrimage here. That's all for this episode. Thanks again to Chad Estes for speaking with me, and a special shout out to all the great folks with the Boise chapter of American Pilgrims. All episodes of the Camino podcast can be found on Spotify, Apple, SoundCloud, and YouTube. You can reach me at CaminoPodcast@gmail.com and through the Camino Podcast Facebook page. Back at some point. Take care, everybody.
Nobody asked me my name. Maybe my baby will never see